If you were to glance at the thumbnails for my Series 8 reviews up until this point, you could be forgiven for thinking that I'm just out to hate on this series. And while I do maintain that all of this darker, edgier, morally questionable Doctor nonsense is just an inherently dumb concept to base a whole series arc around, I want to be clear that in isolation there is potential to be had from exploring the moral grey areas of the character, and Mummy on the Orient Express is a good example of how to do it right. The whole premise of this episode is basically a massive callback to a throwaway line from The Big Bang in Series 5, and it's one of those where knowledge of that context doesn't really affect your experience in any way. It's just a nice little Easter egg for long-time viewers, which is how references should work. Moffat, take note. So the Doctor and Clara land on the titular Orient Express, specifically the variant of it that travels through space, and we find out that this is supposedly a farewell trip for Clara, who has decided to quit travelling with the Doctor after the row they had in the previous episode. Now, this idea of going on one last trip with an abuser or someone you feel the need to cut out of your life is kind of toxic, but that in itself isn't necessarily a problem, since as Council of Geeks points out, Clara does get directly called out on this by Maisie, who quite rightly tells her that you can end a relationship on a slammed door. It happens all the time, and sometimes it's the healthy thing to do. The episode, and indeed the series as a whole, does seem to be conscious of the fact that the Doctor and Clara are two people who are just not really good for each other, and this ultimately comes to a head in the finale of Series 9. The thing is though, watching two main characters who are clearly in an unhealthy relationship, with patterns of abusive behaviour that are a little too real at times, is not a pleasant experience. I haven't really touched on this at any great length so far, but the Doctor and Clara's domestics are threaded throughout most of these episodes I've reviewed, and it really saps a lot of the fun and enjoyment out of what is essentially a show I come to for escapism. In a different piece of media it might have worked, but it doesn't belong in Doctor Who, and it's one of the reasons I feel this era doesn't really get going properly until Series 10 once Clara is gone. Fortunately, the domestics are pushed to one side fairly quickly once the main threat kicks in. The mummy taking exactly 66 seconds to kill is an interesting gimmick, and the addition of a timer on screen is an unusual choice, but one which really helps to sell the gimmick and adds to the tension. Of course, it turns out the whole trip was deliberately orchestrated by a mysterious third party, and the train is actually a giant lab full of scientists sent to study the Foretold. I really like this twist. It caught me off guard the first time, as it plays heavily on the assumptions you make based on previous experience that this is just another bunch of wealthy people cruising through space on a famous Earth vessel like in Voyage of the Damned. But in sheer Smith and Pemberton style, the clues are all there, as the Doctor notes early on how much of a coincidence it is that one of the passengers just happens to be an expert on the Foretold, which was incidentally a very neat way of working in some exposition. This is as good a point as any to mention that the supporting cast for this episode are very strong, with Perkins the engineer a particularly memorable highlight, mainly thanks to the perfect comedically timed delivery of Frank Skinner. The captain is a nice subversion of an old Doctor Who trope, initially refusing to listen and being obstructive, only to then do a complete 180 and assist the investigation once 3 people have been killed, later going on to have his own heroic death scene. And not forgetting Gus, the ever-polite but homicidal computer, presumably installed by the mysterious unnamed third party who serves as the real antagonist of the story. Going back to the main cast though, the Doctor is at his most cold and insensitive here, showing no apparent compassion toward the victims of the Foretold, and I actually don't mind this. At first glance it may seem no different to his treatment of Journey Blue from Into the Dalek, which I previously took issue with, but this time there is a justification and a precedent for his behaviour. In the classic series we actually see Tom Baker's Doctor act in the same cool, pragmatic manner in Pyramids of Mars, as he understands the full scope of what is at stake, conveyed brilliantly to the audience through a vision of an alternate future in which the Earth is an uninhabited wasteland. Similarly, Capaldi's Doctor is thinking of the bigger picture and the fact that they are literally up against the clock. As he says, people with guns to their heads cannot mourn. The longer it takes to find a solution, the more people are going to die, and the Doctor accepts it as a given that people are going to die. It's just a question of how many. As I said in my Series 8 overview, it's a shame that the message about how sometimes the only choices you have are bad ones is somewhat undermined by this episode coming so soon after Day of the Doctor, but as a thematic concept it is nonetheless far more mature and meaningful than any of that drivel about hating the architect from Time Heist, for instance. Too often in Doctor Who and other shows like it, there's some contrivance that means the main hero gets to conveniently wash their hands of whatever moral dilemma they are up against, and it's refreshing to see that trope inverted. That being said, the Doctor still gets to have a badass heroic moment when he finally faces up to the mummy and is able to deduce its origin and work out how to stop it, all within the 66-second time limit. And on a related note, it's nice to see that the Doctor's prejudice against soldiers is largely absent from this episode. I also like the cooldown scene in the TARDIS afterward, not the part where Clara lies to both Danny and the Doctor, but the part about how the Doctor frequently and deliberately puts themselves in these kind of situations. This is the closest that Series 8 actually comes to genuinely exploring the quote-unquote darker side of the character, if we're going to call it that. Because although everything the Doctor does in the episode can be morally justified, it's reasonable to question whether it's really healthy for someone to be so desensitized to making impossible choices, manipulating and playing with people's lives who he knows are going to die, and one cannot deny that the Time Lord is in his element here. Whereas previous episodes like The Caretaker butcher the character, Mummy on the Orient Express works because it instead builds on what has already been established about the Doctor. If you're going to try and portray them as morally ambiguous and are absolutely insistent on telling that story, then this is the way to do it. I'm Midnight Chimes, and I travel in time and space. And trains.